Good morning, Dan and Amy. Steve on 88 is going to make Ulster, New York County legislator Jennifer Schwartz-Berkey's PTSD panting as ringtone. I think that's a good idea.
That is one of the most spectacular breakdowns for a speeding ticket that I've ever heard.
Yeah. On a more substantial law enforcement matter, just slightly.
And a serious one.
Paul Manafort's indictment yesterday, the plea agreement that was revealed between the federal government and George Papadopoulos, who was not a texter from 847. He was not the fuzzy elephant on Sesame Street that was Snuffleup, I guess. I understand the confusion, though.
I love that last name, though, Papadopoulos.
Alex
What's
Karras
not to love?
played George Papadopoulos wonderfully in Webster. So here is Kevin Downing, Manafort's attorney, addressing the indictment.
There is no evidence that Mr. Manafort or the Trump campaign colluded with the Russian government. Mr. Manafort represented pro-European Union campaigns for the Ukrainian. And in that, he was seeking to further democracy and to help the Ukraine come closer to the United States and the EU. Those activities ended in 2014, over 2 years before Mr. Manafort served in the Trump campaign. Today, you see an indictment brought by an Office of Special Counsel that is using a very novel theory to prosecute Mr. Manafort regarding a FARA filing. The United States government has only used that offense 6 times since 1966 and only resulted in 1 conviction. The second thing about this indictment that I myself find most ridiculous is a claim that maintaining offshore accounts to bring all your funds into the United States as a scheme to conceal from the United States government is ridiculous. Thank you.
There's a lot there. Some of it, I think Downing has a point. Other things he's just kind of spinning in terms of things like Manafort's work in the Ukraine. Yanukovych, not exactly a force for
No, it's all
peaceful
about diplomacy.
pluralism.
Yeah.
But here's a famed constitutional lawyer and criminal defense attorney from time to time, Alan Dershowitz, on the topic, what the federal government's really doing here.
They're going to try to get Manafort on a documentary case. They have his wire transfers. They have his connections to the Ukraine, his tax returns. They're going to say to him, it's an open and shut case. If you want to protect yourself, you have to give us leads, information, direct eyewitness testimony, and that's what they're going to try to get from him and use that to prove if there are any crimes. So far, I have seen no evidence of any crimes against the president, but Mueller may know things that we don't know.
Somebody who also knows things we don't know is Ron Hosko, former FBI Assistant Director, now President of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. Ron, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
It's good to be with you. Trick or treat from Bob Mueller, huh?
Yeah, right. The October surprise, although it wasn't much of one. I mean, since they raided Manafort's house just a few weeks ago, that's a leading indicator of where that's going. But what about what Dershowitz said? This is really maybe a case that's overcharged even, and the purpose is they can get Mueller. They could get Manafort on some of these documentation charges, and so they're trying to squeeze him to level up.
Well, first, they're absolutely trying to squeeze him, but I don't, from my vantage point, I don't see it as being necessarily overcharged. It's true that FARA is very seldom used as substantive charges here. However, I think the failure to file as a register as a foreign agent plays into the bigger theme here, which is false statements, across the board on taxes, essentially tax evasion, failing to declare foreign bank accounts. It plays in with the broader theme. And as I read the indictment, I actually saw ways that they could have broken out or added additional bank fraud charges with respect to, the way the mortgages were obtained or home equity money. I think they could have added a lot more counts if they wanted to really go overboard. They probably could have crafted this into a 100-count indictment or a 200-count indictment. But I think the indictment makes a very powerful case. And the point to Manafort from Mueller and company is, if you have information of value, you better come across from it. Otherwise, you may get a sentence that is, in effect, for a 68-year-old man, a life sentence.
Wow. So Paul Manafort, now a criminal defendant under home arrest, his bond was set at what, $10 million yesterday. Does this get to the heart, though, of the Russian influence question?
You know, it doesn't right now. I think actually the Papadopoulos information, and that information that came out, later yesterday morning, comes closer to the heart of the matter. But I think we have to keep in mind, Mueller's only been in this job for about 6 months. He has a very experienced team. I do think personally that the indictment of Manafort and Gates came in advance of my expected timetable. That is slowed by all the international activity and contacts that are going to be involved in building these cases. When you have transactions that are overseas, and very likely many of them, whether that's email, banking, phone calls, otherwise, and you need a good witness for some of that transactional material, it's going to slow the FBI, the Mueller investigation. It's going to slow down the work. I think in ways Gates and Manafort made it easy for the investigators in this case because of big, bold moves to deny certain things that they were doing that were provably false. They made this easier, and so here we are at this timeline. But I think we're very much at the beginning, not at the end.
Yeah, I mean, just on the money laundering charge with respect to Manafort and Gates, Andy McCarthy points out, former federal prosecutor in New York, that it's certainly a terrible thing to take money under the guise of political consulting for an unsavory Ukrainian political faction doing the Kremlin's bidding, but it's not a violation of American law to do so. And for the money laundering charge to stick, Manafort and Gates had to know the money was proceeds of activity that is in violation of American law, and then transported the money the way they did to avoid having to disclose it. But that first part about knowingly acquiring money illegally, that seems to be very much in doubt, doesn't it?
Well, there's a strong movement. The criminal justice reform movement has this, louder and louder notion that there's a mens rea element, which is what you're referring to, criminal intent. Did you intend this harmful result, this specific intent? And that there's a lot of the federal law that doesn't have a clear intent element spelled out in the law itself. Therefore, a lot of crime that we recognize today ought to be, rewritten or taken off the books. I think that's going to be, difficult to defend in a case here where we all know it's our obligation to file truthful statements on our tax returns, potentially, with respect to banking activity, international banking activity. And if you know you have international bank accounts or foreign bank accounts that are stuffed with millions of dollars, and you're using that, in effect, to conceal your income that's paying for high-dollar things, and you are consistently denying that exists, I think there's going to be a strong case here by Mueller and company to say he, of course, knows that's wrong. It's on all of our tax forms. There's a block to check. You have to sign. There's penalty of perjury on all of these forms, and everybody in America knows that's wrong. Now,
what about?
They may give it a try.
Well, what about the new intent standard that Comey created for Hillary and how that may factor in?
Well, that's a good point. And listen, I think there are plenty of folks who would agree that somehow there was an intent element added by the director that does not exist in the statute. I read the statute many, many times, and I saw what you saw, and it of course feeds this frustration by a lot of folks saying, expand the scope of what you're doing, Bob Mueller, because there's criminality on the other side of the aisle as well. And I think there are reasonable people who would say that's absolutely what needs to be done. We'll see now, because as we know, John Podesta's brother apparently took a leave of his
stepped down,
position, and does he know he's in trouble as well on similar things? Time will tell, but I certainly people on the political right would like nothing more than to see Mueller expand it out and start looking in that direction.
Yeah, and looking at different parties. The left is celebrating this morning, though, because of the plea deal of George Papadopoulos. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. But do you know, with your sources, do you know if he was wired? Because he was arrested 3 months ago at Dulles Airport and then pled guilty just 3 weeks ago.
Well, let me say two things. One, my sources tell me that Bob Mueller and company have this thing so tight, nothing is leaking out of that special counsel's office. And this information, this criminal information, the guilty plea by Papadopoulos, is evidence of that. He's apparently been cooperating with them for at least a couple of months, with language in the plea documents that strongly suggests proactive cooperation.
So that means is that translation wearing a wire?
Yes. In short, it is him very likely venturing to other people in his circle, contacting them, bumping up against them, saying, "Hey, I have trouble. The FBI has contacted me. I'm going to be interviewed next week. What am I going to do?" And throwing that bait in the water, and that could well be a recorded conversation, multiple recorded conversations. My guess is that people around Papadopoulos, they know they've had that sort of contact by him, whether it's a call or a knock on their door, and they know their vulnerability because of the conversation they perhaps had with him, very possibly a recorded conversation that's in possession of Bob Mueller. Or it could be that Mueller's already interviewed them on the back of a recorded conversation, and they are now cooperating against others.
And so
that should put a chill up the spine of anybody who is inclined to lie to Mueller and his team. Be warned. He sent the airburst up yesterday as a note to anybody. If you lie to me, I'll charge you on 1,001, if not other crimes.
Well, but with Papadopoulos, who is this sort of this nobody, frankly, and I mean it's Trump's fault for letting people like him around his campaign. So I'm not absolving anybody of responsibility for his involvement, but it seems fairly limited, and this guy doesn't seem particularly sophisticated or experienced. The idea he was on even this advisory foreign policy council during the campaign is bizarre to me. But do you think that the reason they indicted Manafort and Gates yesterday is in part because whatever Papadopoulos was able to glean, they had exhausted him as a source of information? Maybe his contacts were limited in terms of getting too far up the food chain, or he did whatever he could, and it was time to just move on and find another source of information, i.e. Manafort.
Dan, yes to all the above. At a certain point, the utility of a cooperator, ends because of just what you're suggesting, that their circle is very limited, that they can't take you, anywhere substantive. And so you lose nothing by outing them, but he gains a lot by outing him with 1,001, false statements to the FBI count. And I do think that is a message to others, and almost a counterpoint to yesterday's events with the indictment and the expected comments back from the White House that, look, this was not about Russian influence. Read it. This was about his prior business dealings. That's true. However, on the false statements charge on Papadopoulos, you do have somebody who showed an eagerness to engage with the Russians and getting dirt on Hillary, and it does play into the theme. So I think perhaps Mueller calculated it as a nice counterpoint to what he figured would come out of the White House. Oh, but this is, it's not a blockbuster indictment. It's not, a grand indictment of 20 people, co-conspirators, but it starts to play into that same theme of Russian influence was something that the Trump campaign was welcoming.
He is Ron Hosko, former FBI Assistant Director, now President of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. Ron, thanks for joining us. Appreciate your insights as always.
Always a pleasure.
And Papadopoulos, he graduated Niles West High School in 2005. He's young.
Yeah, he's like 30 years old.
I know. And then he went on to DePaul University, a local
He was
kid.
an intern
It's
at the
so
Hudson
weird
Institute. I mean, this is basically
how he got close to the president.
No credentials.
Yeah. Well, and Ron joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio